It was one of those perfect London afternoons that brings tourists from all corners of the world to Buckingham Palace. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and hundreds of people had gathered to watch the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Families with children, elderly couples on vacation, young backpackers with cameras. Everyone was excited to see this piece of British tradition. Among the crowd stood a man in his late 20s. He wore a dirty baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and had multiple tattoos crawling up his arms. His name doesn't matter for this story, but what he carried in his heart certainly does. This man harbored deep hatred towards people who looked different from him. He had spent years feeding his mind with poisonous ideas from online forums and hate groups. The ceremony was about to begin. The royal guard stood at attention in their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats. Their faces were serious, their posture perfect. These weren't just men in costumes. They were real soldiers, trained warriors who had served their country in dangerous places around the world. But to most tourists, they were simply part of the show, like living statues. As more people gathered, the crowd became more diverse. There were visitors from India taking selfies with their grandchildren. A group of Japanese students chatted excitedly in their language while pointing at the palace. An African family had traveled all the way from Nigeria to see this famous ceremony. Their young daughter, maybe 8 years old, was bouncing with excitement as she held her father's hand. That's when things started to change. The man with the baseball cap began muttering under his breath. At first, nobody paid attention. London is full of people talking to themselves. But his voice grew louder. He started making comments about the foreigners around him. His words were ugly, filled with the kind of hatred that makes decent people's stomachs turn. A few tourists near him shifted uncomfortably. Some moved away, pretending they hadn't heard anything. Others exchanged worried glances. But most people were still focused on the ceremony, unaware that something terrible was building just a few feet away. The Nigerian family was taking photos near the palace gates. The little girl was posing with the biggest smile, making peace signs with her fingers. Her parents were laughing, trying to get the perfect shot. They were having the time of their lives, completely innocent and joyful. This beautiful family moment seemed to trigger something dark in the hateful man. His muttering became louder. He started pointing at them, saying horrible things about their skin color, their right to be there, their very existence. The ugly words poured out of him like poison from an infected wound. Now people were definitely noticing. The crowd around him began to thin out as families with children moved away. But some stayed, frozen by shock or morbid curiosity. This doesn't happen every day at Buckingham Palace. Security cameras captured everything, but the guards weren't looking at the crowd. They were focused straight ahead as their training demanded. The Nigerian father heard the comments. His smile faded. He instinctively moved closer to his daughter, placing his body between her and the source of hatred. His wife grabbed their child's hand tighter. They had come to London expecting to make beautiful memories, not to face this kind of ugliness. But the hateful man wasn't finished. His voice grew even louder. He started walking closer to the family, his face twisted with rage. Other tourists began pulling out their phones, some to record what was happening, others to call for help. The atmosphere changed completely. What had been a cheerful, festive crowd was now tense and frightened. One of the royal guards, a tall, dignified soldier, with kind eyes, couldn't help but notice the disturbance. His training told him to stay perfectly still, to ignore everything except his ceremonial duties. But he was human first, soldier second. He could see the fear in the little girl's eyes. He could hear the venom in the angry man's voice. The guard had served 3 tours of duty overseas. He had seen real evil, real hatred, real violence. He knew what it looked like when someone was about to cross a line from words to actions. And every instinct in his body was telling him that this situation was about to explode. More people in the crowd were now aware of what was happening. Some tried to intervene quietly, moving between the angry man and the family. An elderly woman from Germany whispered to her husband in worried German. A group of American college students looked around nervously, unsure whether they should do something or just get out of there. The ceremony continued, but the joyful atmosphere was completely gone. Instead of pointing cameras at the guards, people were recording the ugly scene unfolding in the crowd. Social media was about to get its hands on something that would shock the world. The angry man was now shouting. His words were so hateful, so violent, that even hardened London police officers would later say they had rarely heard such vicious language in public. He was calling for people to go back where they came from, using words that can't be repeated, in polite company. But words weren't going to be enough for him. His hands were clenched into fists. His whole body was shaking with rage. The crowd could sense that something much worse was coming. Parents grabbed their children. Elderly tourists looked around for security. Everyone could feel that they were witnessing the calm before a terrible storm. The Royal Guard, the same one who had been watching with growing concern, made a decision that would change everything. He had sworn an oath to protect the crown and the people of Britain. That included everyone in this crowd, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like. His duty wasn't just to stand still and look impressive. It was to serve and protect. What happened next would be talked about for years to come. It would be shared millions of times online. It would restore people's faith in humanity and prove that even in our darkest moments, there are still heroes willing to stand up for what's right. But first, the situation had to get much worse. The angry man was about to do something that would shock everyone present, something that would turn a disturbing incident into an international crisis. The little girl from Nigeria was still holding her father's hand, not understanding why the nice day had turned so scary. The crowd held its breath, sensing that they were about to witness something that would change them all forever. The stage was set. The players were in position. And what happened in the next few minutes would prove that sometimes in the face of pure hatred, ordinary people can become extraordinary heroes. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Everyone knew something bad was about to happen, but nobody could have predicted just how shocking it would be. The angry man had worked himself into such a rage that his face was red and sweat was dripping down his forehead despite the cool London breeze. The Nigerian family was trying their best to ignore him, but it was impossible. The father whispered something to his wife, probably telling her they should leave. But before they could move, the situation exploded in a way that nobody saw coming. Without any warning, the hateful man suddenly charged forward, not toward the family, but straight toward the ceremonial barriers that separated the crowd from the royal guards. The red rope barriers that had stood there for decades, respected by millions of tourists, meant nothing to him in that moment of pure rage. People started screaming. Not the excited screams of tourists seeing something amazing, but real screams of terror. Children began crying. Parents grabbed their kids and started running in all directions. The peaceful ceremony turned into chaos in less than 3 seconds. The Royal Guard, the same one who had been watching the situation develop, couldn't believe what he was seeing. In all his years of ceremonial duty, nothing like this had ever happened. Tourists sometimes got too close for photos, sure. Occasionally someone would shout something inappropriate. But this was completely unprecedented. The angry man didn't stop at the barriers. He kept running, his eyes locked on the guard with an intensity that was truly frightening. Palace. Security immediately started moving, but they were positioned around the perimeter. Nobody expected someone to attack a ceremonial guard directly. The protocols weren't designed for this kind of situation. What happened next will be remembered forever by everyone who witnessed it. The charging man reached the guard and in one swift motion that caught everyone off guard, grabbed for the ceremonial sword hanging at the soldier's side. The sword that was supposed to be purely decorative, a symbol of tradition and honor. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The guard felt the tug on his uniform. The crowd held its breath. Security guards were running but still too far away. And then, incredibly, impossibly, the angry man actually managed to pull the sword free from its sheath. The sound of metal sliding against metal cut through all the screaming. The blade caught the sunlight as it came free, creating a flash that temporarily blinded several people taking photos. Suddenly, this wasn't just a disturbing incident anymore. This was a genuine security emergency. The man held the sword up in the air like some kind of twisted trophy. His face showed a mixture of triumph and continued rage. He had crossed a line that nobody thought possible. He had taken a weapon from a member of the Queen's Guard in broad daylight, in front of hundreds of witnesses with cameras recording everything. But having the sword seemed to make him even more dangerous, not less. The weight of the blade, the feel of the handle in his grip, the shocked faces all around him, it all fed into his delusions of power. He started waving it around wildly, shouting even louder than before. The crowd was now in full panic mode. People were trampling over each other trying to get away. Tour guides were screaming instructions in multiple languages. Street vendors abandoned their carts and ran. Even the famous London pigeons took flight as if they could sense the danger. The Royal Guard stood perfectly still for a moment, processing what had just happened. His training had prepared him for many things, but not this exact scenario. His ceremonial sword, a blade that had been blessed and carried with honor, was now in the hands of someone filled with hate. Police sirens started wailing in the distance. Someone had managed to call for help, but emergency responders were still minutes away. Those minutes felt like hours to everyone trapped in the chaos. The man with the sword was now the center of a rapidly expanding circle of terror. Anyone within 50 feet of him was running for their lives. But he wasn't finished with his rampage. His eyes kept darting back to the Nigerian family, who were now huddled together near a palace wall, too scared to move but unable to find a clear path to safety. Security cameras captured every angle of what was happening. Later, experts would analyze the footage frame by frame, trying to understand how the situation had spiraled so quickly out of control. But in that moment, all anyone could think about was survival. The guard faced an impossible choice. His ceremonial duty required him to maintain his position and composure. But his human instincts, his military training, and his moral compass all told him that innocent people were in danger. The little girl who had been so happy just minutes before was now crying in her father's arms. Other tourists were recording everything on their phones, even as they backed away in fear. The footage would later be viewed millions of times around the world. But right then, social media was the last thing on anyone's mind. This was real life, real danger, real terror unfolding in broad daylight. The man with the sword seemed to grow more unstable by the second. Having crossed one impossible line, he appeared ready to cross others. His shouting became more incoherent, more threatening. The blade trembled in his hands, reflecting the sunlight in dangerous flashes. Palace security was now coordinating with metropolitan police units racing to the scene. Radio chatter filled the air as officers tried to understand exactly what they were dealing with. A man with a weapon at Buckingham Palace? It sounded like something from a movie, not real life. But the most shocking thing of all was still to come. Because while everyone expected this situation to end in violence, while security forces prepared for the worst possible outcome, while the crowd braced for something terrible, nobody could have predicted what the Royal Guard was about to do. The soldier who had just been robbed of his ceremonial sword was about to make a decision that would surprise everyone present. Instead of calling for backup, instead of following standard protocol, instead of treating this as a military threat, he was about to do something so unexpected, so human, so powerful, that it would change not just this situation, but the lives of everyone who witnessed it. The stage was set for something that would restore people's faith in humanity. But first, the terror had to reach its peak. The man with the sword raised it higher, his voice growing even more threatening. The little girl's cries grew louder, and the world held its breath, waiting to see how this impossible situation would resolve itself. What happened next would be talked about for generations. Everyone expected the Royal Guard to panic. Everyone expected him to shout for help, to run for cover, or to fight back with force. That's what any normal person would do when someone steals their weapon and starts threatening innocent people. But what happened next left every single person in that crowd completely speechless. The guard did something that nobody saw coming. Instead of reacting with anger or fear, he slowly and deliberately reached up to his head and removed his famous tall black hat, the bear skin that's become a symbol of British tradition around the world. He placed it carefully on the ground, beside him like he was setting down something precious. The crowd fell silent, Even the man with the sword stopped shouting for a moment, confused by this unexpected action. Here was a soldier who had just been robbed and threatened, and instead of fighting back, he was calmly removing his ceremonial headgear. It didn't make sense to anyone watching. Then the guard did something even more surprising. He looked directly at the angry man, not with hatred or fear, but with something that looked almost like compassion. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet and steady. So quiet that people in the crowd had to strain to hear him over the distant sirens and the general chaos. "I know you're angry," the guard said, his words cutting through the noise like a knife through butter. "I can see the pain in your eyes, but this isn't the way to deal with it." The man with the sword was so shocked that he actually took a step backward. Nobody talks like that to someone who's threatening them with a weapon. Nobody stays that calm in a situation like this. But the guard wasn't finished. "My name doesn't matter," the soldier continued, his voice still gentle but strong. "But my story might. I've been where you are. I've felt that anger burning inside me like fire. I know what it's like to want to blame someone else for all the pain in your life." By now, the entire crowd was listening. People who had been running away stopped in their tracks. Even the police officers who were starting to arrive at the scene held back, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. This wasn't following any script they had ever seen before. The guard began to tell his story. He spoke about growing up in a rough neighborhood where violence was common and hope was rare. He talked about losing friends to gangs and drugs. He described feeling angry at the world, angry at people who seemed to have better lives than him, angry at anyone who looked different or came from somewhere else. "I used to think just like you do," he said to the man with the sword. "I used to believe that if I could just hurt the right people, somehow my own pain would go away. But it doesn't work like that. Hate only creates more hate. Pain only creates more pain." The crowd was mesmerized. Here was a man in uniform, a symbol of authority and power, talking about his own struggles with anger and hatred. He wasn't preaching or lecturing. He was just sharing his truth, human being to human being. The soldier went on to describe how he had joined the army not because he was patriotic, but because he was lost and needed direction. He talked about his first deployment overseas, how scared he was, how unprepared he felt for the reality of combat. But then he started talking about the other soldiers he served with, people from all different backgrounds, all different colors, all different faiths. "There was this one guy," the guard said, his voice getting softer. "He was from the same country as that beautiful family you were shouting at earlier. He saved my life 3 times in Afghanistan. 3 times he put himself between me and enemy fire. He didn't care that I was white and he was black. He didn't care that I came from London and he came from Lagos. All he cared about was that we were brothers in arms." You could hear a pin drop in that crowd. Even the man with the sword was listening intently now, though his grip on the weapon hadn't loosened. The guard's words were having an effect that no amount of shouting or force could have achieved. The soldier described coming home from war and struggling with what he had seen and done. He talked about the nightmares, the guilt, the feeling that he didn't deserve to be alive when so many good people had died. He spoke about turning to alcohol, about pushing away everyone who tried to help him, about feeling like the world owed him something. "But slowly I started to understand something," he continued. "The enemy wasn't people who looked different from me. The enemy was the hate inside my own heart, and the only way to defeat that enemy was to replace it with something stronger." By now, people in the crowd were crying, not from fear anymore, but from the raw honesty of what they were hearing. This wasn't a speech or a performance. This was one human being opening his heart to another, even in the most dangerous of circumstances. The guard talked about choosing to serve in the ceremonial unit, about learning the history and traditions he now represented. He spoke about the honor of protecting not just the royal family, but everyone who came to see them, tourists from every corner of the world, including places he had once viewed with suspicion or hatred. "Every day I stand here," he said, gesturing to the spot where he had been posted. "I'm reminded that my job isn't just to look impressive in a uniform. My job is to represent the best of what we can be, to show that it's possible to move beyond hate, beyond fear, beyond the need to hurt others because we're hurting inside. The man with the sword was trembling now, but not with rage anymore. Something was happening to him that he couldn't quite understand. The words he was hearing were cutting through years of anger and resentment, like that sword had cut through the air just minutes before. Other people in the crowd started to step forward, not to threaten or confront, but to listen more closely. The circle of fear that had surrounded the armed man was slowly transforming into something else entirely, a circle of human connection and understanding. The police officers on the scene were experienced professionals who had dealt with every kind of crisis imaginable, but they had never seen anything like this. Their training told them to take down the threat, to end the situation quickly and decisively. But their instincts told them that something much more important was happening here than just another security incident. The Royal Guard wasn't finished with his story. He was about to share something even more personal, something that would change, not just this moment, but potentially the entire life of the man standing before him with a stolen sword. The transformation that was beginning would soon spread beyond just these two men to everyone watching, and eventually to millions of people around the world who would see this footage. But first, the man with the weapon had to make a choice that would define the rest of his life. The man with the sword was expecting something completely different. He was expecting fear, anger, maybe even violence in return. He had spent years surrounding himself with people who thought just like him, who fed his hatred and told him he was right to feel the way he did. But standing there in front of this calm, honest soldier, he was hearing something he had never heard before, the truth about what hate really does to a person. His grip on the sword started to loosen slightly, not because he was giving up, but because the guard's words were creating doubt in his mind, doubt about everything he had believed for so long. The anger was still there, burning in his chest, but now it was mixed with confusion and something else he couldn't quite identify. That's when something amazing started to happen in the crowd. One by one, other people began to step forward, not to attack or confront the armed man, but to add their own voices to what the guard had started. The first person to move was an older gentleman with gray hair and kind eyes. He had been standing near the back of the crowd with his wife, and when the chaos started, his first instinct had been to protect her and get her to safety. But something about the guard's words had touched him deeply. "Excuse me," the older man said, his voice shaky but determined. "I hope you don't mind if I say something too." He looked at the man with the sword, not with fear, but with genuine concern. "I'm a veteran too, served in the Falklands War 40 years ago, and I want you to know that I understand what it feels like to come home from war and feel like nobody cares about your sacrifice." The crowd was listening intently. Here was another person willing to be vulnerable, to share his own pain in the hope of reaching someone who was clearly suffering. The older veteran continued, "When I came back from the war, I was angry too. Angry at politicians who sent us to fight. Angry at people who went on with their normal lives while we were dealing with things no human should have to see. I drank too much. I pushed away my family. I blamed everyone else for the emptiness I felt inside." The man with the sword was looking back and forth between the guard and this new speaker, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. These weren't his enemies lecturing him. These were people who had walked similar paths, who understood his pain from the inside. Then another voice joined in. This time it was a woman in her 50s with a gentle face and wearing a simple dress. She had been visiting London with her sister, just trying to have a nice day out, when everything went crazy. But instead of running away, she felt called to speak. "I lost my son in Iraq," she said quietly, and several people in the crowd gasped. This wasn't what anyone expected to hear. He was only 19, full of dreams and hope for the future. For years after he died, I was so angry I could barely function. I was angry at the military, angry at the government, angry at God, angry at anyone who still had their children with them. The woman's voice was getting stronger as she continued. "But you know what I discovered? All that anger wasn't bringing my boy back. It was just eating me alive from the inside. It was stealing whatever good years I had left and turning them into years of bitterness and hate. By now, there were tears in many people's eyes, including some of the police officers who had arrived to handle what they thought would be a standard security threat. This was turning into something none of them had ever experienced before. The Nigerian father, the same man who had been the target of the initial hatred, did something that shocked everyone present. Instead of staying safely back with his family, he slowly walked forward until he was close enough to look the armed man directly in the eyes. "My friend," he said in accented but clear English, "I want you to know that I don't hate you for what you said about my family. I feel sorry for you because I can see that you're in pain. In my country, we have a saying, hurt people hurt people. I think that's what's happening here today." The man with the sword was trembling now, but not with rage anymore. Something was breaking apart inside him, something that had been hard and bitter for so long that he had forgotten it could ever be soft again. The Nigerian man's kindness in the face of hatred was more powerful than any weapon. More people started stepping forward. A young woman who had been backpacking across Europe talked about feeling lost and angry after her parents' divorce. A middle-aged man shared his struggles with unemployment and depression. An elderly lady with a thick German accent spoke quietly about surviving the Holocaust and learning that hatred only creates more victims. Each story was different, but they all had something in common. Every person who spoke had experienced real pain, real loss, real reasons to be angry at the world, but they had all found ways to move beyond that anger, to choose healing over hatred, connection over conflict. The circle around the man with the sword was no longer a circle of fear. It had become a circle of understanding, of shared human experience, of people willing to be vulnerable in order to help someone who was clearly suffering. Even the police officers were affected by what they were witnessing. These were hardened professionals who had seen the worst of human nature, but they were watching something that restored their faith in the best of what people could be. Several of them were discreetly wiping away tears as they listened to the stories being shared. The man holding the sword looked around at all these faces, faces that had been strangers just minutes before, but were now looking at him with compassion instead of fear. For the first time in years, he felt truly seen. Not as a villain or a threat, but as a human being who was hurting and needed help. The sword in his hands suddenly felt incredibly heavy, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. It was a symbol of all the anger and hatred he had been carrying around for so long, all the blame he had placed on others for his own pain, all the walls he had built to keep people out, walls that had also kept out any chance of healing or connection. His hands started to shake. The blade caught the sunlight again, but this time, instead of looking threatening, it looked almost fragile, like it might shatter if he held onto it much longer. The royal guard who had started this incredible transformation with his honest words took a small step forward, not in a threatening way, but like he was approaching a wounded animal that might run away if he moved too quickly. "It's okay," the guard said softly. "You don't have to carry all that weight anymore. You don't have to be angry forever. There's another way to live, and all these people around us are proof of that." The man with the sword looked into the guard's eyes and saw something he hadn't seen in another person's face for longer than he could remember. He saw acceptance. He saw forgiveness. He saw hope that maybe, just maybe, he could become someone different than who he had been. The moment felt like it lasted forever, but it was probably only a few seconds. The man with the sword stood there, surrounded by people who had shared their deepest pain and shown him incredible kindness. His whole body was shaking now, not from anger, but from something much deeper, the realization that everything he had believed about the world might be wrong. Slowly, very slowly, he began to lower the sword. His grip loosened, and the blade pointed toward the ground instead of at the people around him. You could hear the collective sigh of relief from the crowd, but nobody moved yet. Everyone sensed that this fragile moment could still go either way. The royal guard took another careful step forward. "It's okay," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can let it go now. You don't need it anymore." And then something beautiful happened. The man's fingers opened, and the ceremonial sword fell to the ground with a metallic clang that echoed off the palace walls. As soon as it hit the pavement, his legs gave out, and he collapsed to his knees, years of rage and hatred finally leaving his body in huge, shaking sobs. The police officers moved in quickly but gently. They had been expecting to tackle a dangerous criminal, but what they found was a broken human being who clearly needed help more than punishment. They handcuffed him, but they did it with unusual care and kindness, influenced by everything they had just witnessed. As they helped him to his feet, the man looked back at the guard with tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything." The guard picked up his ceremonial sword and slid it back into its sheath. Then he did something that surprised everyone one more time. He walked over to the man who had just threatened him and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I forgive you," the guard said simply, "and I hope you can learn to forgive yourself too." The crowd erupted in applause, but it wasn't the kind of applause you hear at a show or a sports game. It was deeper than that, more emotional. People were clapping through their tears, moved by what they had just witnessed. Some were hugging strangers, others were calling loved ones to tell them about the incredible thing they had just seen. The police led the man away, but the story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The videos started appearing online within hours. Dozens of people had recorded different parts of what happened, and soon the footage was being shared around the world. But unlike most viral videos that show conflict and division, this one showed something different. It showed the power of human compassion to transform even the most hopeless situations. The Royal Guard became famous overnight, but not in the way he expected. News stations wanted to interview him, but he kept declining. He didn't want to be seen as a hero. He just wanted people to understand that we all have the capacity for both hatred and love, and we get to choose which one we feed. The man who had stolen the sword was charged with several serious crimes, including threatening behavior and theft. But something unusual happened during his court proceedings. Instead of just wanting punishment, people started asking questions about how someone gets to that point of hatred. What kind of pain drives a person to act that way? The court ordered psychological evaluation and counseling instead of just prison time. The man spent months in therapy, working through years of trauma and anger that had been building up inside him. He learned about the sources of his hatred, about how fear and pain had been twisted into rage against innocent people. But the biggest surprise came 6 months later. The Royal Guard asked to visit him in the rehabilitation facility where he was getting treatment. The two men sat across from each other in a simple room. No cameras, no crowds, just two human beings talking honestly about life and forgiveness. "I keep thinking about that day," the man said to the guard. "About how you could have had me arrested immediately, how you could have fought back, how you could have let the police handle it with force, but instead you chose to see me as a person worth saving." The guard listened quietly, then shared more of his own story. He talked about times when he had been close to making terrible choices, about how other people's kindness had pulled him back from the edge. He explained that helping others heal was really just another way of healing himself. These conversations continued for months. Slowly, the man who had once been filled with hatred began to understand how wrong he had been. He started reading books about other cultures, learning about the histories and struggles of people he had once hated. He began to see that his anger had been misdirected, that the real enemies were ignorance and fear, not people who looked different from him. When he was finally released, he faced a choice. He could go back to his old life, his old friends, his old ways of thinking, or he could try to become someone completely different. The decision wasn't easy, but the memory of that day at Buckingham Palace and the ongoing friendship with the guard who had saved him gave him strength to choose change. He started small. He got a job at a community center, helping with after-school programs for kids from all different backgrounds. He was nervous at first, worried that people would recognize him from the videos or that his past would make him unsuitable for the work. But the center's director had seen those same videos and understood the power of redemption. Working with children from the same communities he had once hated was difficult, but transformative. He saw their innocence, their hopes, their dreams. He realized that these kids were just like he had been once, before life had hardened his heart. He became determined to help them avoid the path of hatred that had nearly destroyed his own life. The Royal Guard heard about his work and started visiting the community center. Together, they began speaking at schools and community events about the dangers of hatred and the possibility of change. Their story became a powerful example of how enemies could become friends, how understanding could replace fear. The Nigerian family that had been the target of the original hatred even attended one of these speaking events. When the man who had once threatened them stood up to apologize publicly, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The little girl, now a year older, walked up to him after the presentation and gave him a drawing she had made, a picture of people of all different colors holding hands under a rainbow. That drawing now hangs in the community center where he works, a daily reminder of the innocence and hope that exists in every child, regardless of their background. It reminds him of how close he came to destroying not just his own life, but the lives of others, and how grateful he is for the second chance he was given. The ceremonial sword that had been at the center of that dramatic day was eventually put on display in a museum exhibit about reconciliation and forgiveness. Visitors from around the world come to see it and to read the story of how one moment of hatred was transformed into a lifetime of healing. The Royal Guard still serves at Buckingham Palace, still stands at attention during ceremonies, still wears his uniform with pride. But now when he looks out at the crowds of tourists, he sees each person as a human being with their own story, their own struggles, their own capacity for both good and evil. And sometimes, on quiet days when the ceremony is over and the crowds have gone home, he thinks about that afternoon when everything changed, when hatred met compassion and lost, when fear met understanding and was defeated, when one person's choice to respond with love instead of anger created ripples that are still spreading around the world, inspiring others to choose healing over hatred one conversation at a time.